The cardstock was the first thing to go wrong, and I remember it because I'd chosen it myself, a heavy cream with a faint deckled edge that cost me 41 cents a sheet at the paper shop on Grant Street. And I had run my thumb along that ragged edge maybe 100 times, imagining my mother's name printed on it. Instead, on a Tuesday night, 11 days before the wedding, Trevor sat me down at our kitchen table, folded his hands the way he did before he said something he'd already decided, and told me that his mother had reviewed the seating and felt the room would flow better if my side stayed smaller. Smaller meant my parents. Smaller meant my sister Renata and her 2 boys, and my Aunt Dorothea, who'd driven 3 hours to my bridal shower with a hand-stitched runner in her purse. He didn't raise his voice, because Trevor never raised his voice. He simply explained it as though it were a load-bearing wall we couldn't move. And when I said no, absolutely not, he tilted his head and asked me, very gently, whether I really wanted to start our marriage by embarrassing his family in front of 200 guests. I sat there with my thumb still moving over the edge of a card I would never send, and I understood, in a slow and sickening way, that he had already made the calls. He'd made them, I found out, a week earlier. My mother had known for 7 days that she'd been uninvited to her own daughter's wedding and had said nothing to me because she didn't want to be the reason I fought with the man I was about to marry. That was the part that hollowed me out. Not his mother, Colleen, with her opinions about Flo and her navy Chanel and her way of calling me the florist to her friends as though it were a diagnosis. It was my own mother sitting on that knowledge in her kitchen in Vandergrift, protecting me from a hurt she'd already absorbed on my behalf, folding and unfolding a napkin the way I now understand I fold and unfold everything. I got married anyway. I want to be honest about that, because it would be easier to tell you I called it off in a blaze of dignity and walked out into a better life. But I didn't. I stood in a rented ballroom at the Chadwick Inn on a Saturday in September of 2022 with 14 people on my side of a room built for 200, and I married Trevor Ellison in a dress I'd altered myself, and I smiled through the toasts, and I danced with my new father-in-law because my own father was watching the whole thing on a phone propped against a sugar bowl in Vandergrift. I told myself it was one decision, one bad night, one overbearing mother, and that marriages are long and forgiveness is longer. I was 33. I believed a lot of things at 33 that I've since had to set down. The marriage lasted 19 months, and I'll spare you the archaeology of how it ended, except to say that the wedding wasn't a fluke. It was a blueprint. What Trevor did to the guest list, he did to the rest of me by degrees so small I kept mistaking them for compromise. My flower shop, which I'd opened at 29 with a loan I paid back myself, became your little hobby at dinner parties. My friends became intense. My hours became a lot to ask of a marriage. And Colleen, who lived 12 minutes away in a stone colonial in Fox Chapel, became a permanent third presence in our house, rearranging my cabinets, correcting my mother's recipes, and once, I still hear it, telling me across my own dinner table that Trevor had married down, but married kind. Trevor laughed at that. He laughed, and he reached over and squeezed my hand, as if the squeeze were an apology. And I understood that in his family, cruelty and affection came braided together so tightly you couldn't pull one loose without the other. The night it actually broke was not dramatic. I found the messages on a shared tablet we used for grocery lists, of all things. A whole second life he'd been running with a woman named Ashley Pruitt, who worked in his mother's book club and had, apparently, been to 2 Ellison family Christmases I was never told about. The betrayal itself I could almost file away. Men leave, hearts wander. I'd have survived that. What I couldn't file away was the discovery, that same week, that the man who'd decided my parents didn't flow had been driving Ashley to Colleen's for the holidays, welcomed, seated, poured wine, given a chair at the very table my mother wasn't allowed to approach. My family was too much for the room. Ashley fit the flow. And so I stopped mistaking small things for compromise. I moved out on a Thursday with 2 suitcases and a cardboard box of my grandmother's canning jars, the wide-mouth blue ball jars from the 1940s that my mother had passed to me because I was the one who liked to grow things. And I want you to remember those jars because they matter later, not as a symbol I planned, but as the one object that traveled every hard mile with me. I put them on the passenger seat of my 10-year-old Subaru, and I drove to a studio apartment above a shuttered hardware store on Fifth Avenue, in a part of the city that had not been fashionable since the steel left. And that was where I lived while my life came apart in a lawyer's conference room. The wreckage was mostly paper, which is the cruelest kind, because it doesn't bleed and it doesn't shout. It just accumulates. Trevor had money in a way I never fully had access to. Family money threaded through a firm called Meridian Capital, where his father had been a managing partner. And money like that hires lawyers who bill by the 6-minute increment and treat a divorce like a hostile acquisition. My flower shop, the one real thing I'd built, had a lease with a personal guarantee, and the landlord, a man named Gus Petrakis, who I'd sent poinsettias to every December, got a very polite letter from Trevor's attorney reminding him that reputational considerations might follow a tenant in litigation. And Gus, who was 71 and tired and didn't want trouble, gave me 60 days. 14 years I'd planned to be in that space. I was out in 9 weeks, selling my walk-in cooler to a caterer in Millvale for a third of what it cost, watching a stranger's truck carry away the steel table where I'd built 400 wedding bouquets. The people scattered the way people do. The vendors I'd shared work with for years suddenly had full calendars. 2 women I'd have called my closest friends turned out to be, more precisely, Trevor's and my friends. And in the split, they were assigned to him the way the good couch was, because his side had the lake house and the box seats at PNC Park and the Ellison Christmas that everyone secretly wanted to be invited to. Colleen, I later heard, told her club that I'd always been unstable, poor thing, and that Trevor had done everything he could. I found out my own aunt in Vandergrift heard a version of that at a funeral. The story got there before I could. And here is the part I circle back to on the nights it still stings, the lowest point, the floor. For about 3 weeks that winter, in the studio above the hardware store, I didn't open the blinds. I'm not going to dress that up. I had a folding table and a mattress on the floor, and a single burner, and I ate the same lentil soup for 11 days because it cost 80 cents a bowl and required nothing of me. And I let the phone go to voicemail, and I understood for the first time in my life how a person could simply stop. What kept me from stopping was not a grand realization. It was a paper white bulb. I'd forced a single paper white narcissus bulb in one of my grandmother's blue ball jars back in November out of nothing but habit, glass pebbles and water, and I'd shoved it on the windowsill and forgotten it. And one gray morning, in that gray winter, I woke up and there was a white bloom leaning toward the crack in the blinds, 3 petals open, and the smell of it, that heavy, sweet green smell, filled the whole miserable room. A bulb doesn't know your husband left. It doesn't know your shop is gone. It just does the one thing it was built to do, on schedule, with the water it's given. I lay there and looked at it for a long time. And then I got up and opened the blinds. And that is the least dramatic and most honest turning point I own. The first step back was a job I was overqualified for and grateful to get. A woman named Estelle Boyd ran a full-service event florist out of a converted firehouse in Lawrenceville, 40 hours a week processing flowers for weddings and corporate galas. And she hired me at $17 an hour to strip thorns and condition roses in a cold back room. No design work, no client contact, just hands and stems and buckets. I took it. I'd owned a shop, and now I was stripping thorns for a wage. And I'd be lying if I said the first month didn't taste like ash. But there's a mercy in work you can do with your hands while your head heals. And Estelle, who was 62 and had buried one husband and divorced a worse one, watched me the way you watch a cutting to see if it'll take. Estelle Boyd is the person this story owes the most to, and she was nobody's idea of a fairy godmother. She was a blunt, foul-mouthed woman who wore reading glasses on a beaded chain and drank her coffee black from a thermos she'd had since the Reagan administration. And she ran that firehouse like a galley. But she noticed things. She noticed that I could wire a boutonniere in half the time of her lead designer, that I knew cut flower diseases the way other people know sports scores, that I stayed late not to impress her, but because I genuinely didn't want to go back to the blinds. About 6 weeks in, she came into the cold room, set her thermos on the steel table, and said, "You used to run your own place." It wasn't a question. When I told her the short version, she listened with her arms folded, and at the end she said only, "He sounds expensive," and went back to work. And somehow, that was exactly the right thing, because it named him without pitying me. The long climb was not a montage. It was slow, and it had teeth, and it took the better part of 2 years. Estelle started handing me design work. Small stuff first, sympathy arrangements and grocery store tier centerpieces, and then real weddings. And by the following spring, I was running install crews at venues where I'd once been a bride with 14 people on her side. That was its own strange education, walking into the Chadwick Inn on a Friday in April to hang a floral arch for someone else's happiness in the very ballroom where I'd married Trevor, and finding that it didn't gut me the way I'd feared. It just felt like a place I used to know. I learned the ledger side, too, the part I'd been sloppy about the first time. I took a Tuesday night bookkeeping class at the community college and learned the difference between being busy and being profitable, which are not the same thing and had quietly killed my first shop from the inside. There were setbacks, real ones, not the tidy kind. A vendor I'd trusted double-booked me on the biggest August wedding of my first solo season, and I lost $4,000 covering the shortfall out of pocket rather than fail a bride. And I cried in the firehouse parking lot at midnight, and then went back in and rebuilt the order from scraps by 4 a.m. My Subaru's transmission died in the middle of the Squirrel Hill Tunnel and cost $1,800 I didn't have. So I put it on a card and ate the interest and drove that car another year on principle. And once, at a bridal expo in the David L. Lawrence Convention Center, I turned a corner with an armful of ranunculus samples and walked directly into Colleen Ellison, who looked at me, looked at my apron, and said, "Oh, you're doing the flowers now," with a little laugh, as though I'd been demoted rather than resurrected, and then swept off toward a cake vendor. I stood there with my heart going like a fist against a door, and I did not chase her, and I did not weep in the aisle. And I want to be clear that holding still in that moment cost me more than any grand speech ever would have. I went back to my booth. I sold 19 weddings that weekend. Somewhere in that second year, a thing happened that I didn't engineer and couldn't have. Estelle called me into her office on a Monday, closed the door, and told me she was 64, her knees were shot, and she wanted out within 18 months, and she'd rather sell the business to me than to a chain that would gut it. I laughed out loud because I had exactly $900 in savings and a maxed card, and she said, "I didn't say I'd give it to you. I said I'd sell it to you, on terms, because you're the only person I've met in 30 years who loves this the way I do and isn't stupid about the money anymore." She carried the paper herself, seller financed, a number we landed on after 3 long evenings at her kitchen table with a legal pad. $190,000 over 7 years, no bank, just her name and mine, and a handshake she meant. Estelle Boyd bet on me when the bet was ugly, and I have never once been late on a payment to her. Not once, and I'd sooner sell blood than be. I renamed the shop Blue Jar Floral after the canning jars, and I put one of my grandmother's actual 1940s ball jars in the front window with a single stem in it that I changed every morning, and word got around. It got around partly because I was good, and partly because Western Pennsylvania is smaller than it looks, and people talk. And the same network that had carried Colleen's version of me now started carrying a different one. The florist who'd lost everything and quietly built something better. The one who sent the funeral flowers for free when the family couldn't pay. The one who employed 2 women coming out of the shelter on Penn Avenue because Estelle had done the same for someone once and told me it was the rent you pay for the space you take up. By the spring of 2024, Blue Jar Floral was booking 18 months out, and I had 4 people on payroll. And I'd bought back, from that same caterer in Millvale, the exact walk-in cooler I'd sold at the bottom for $200 more than he'd paid me, and installing it in my own shop is a small and petty joy I will treasure until I die. I hadn't thought about Trevor in any real way for months when he resurfaced, and he did it the way he did everything, obliquely and with a smile. It came through Renata, my sister, who still lived in Vandergrift and still knew everyone, and who called me on a Wednesday in June to tell me that our old high school class was doing its 20-year reunion. I'd graduated from Kiski area in 2005, and that it was being held not in Vandergrift proper, but at a restored banquet hall in a small city just up the Allegheny, and that Trevor, who'd graduated 2 years ahead of me and whom I'd first met at a homecoming when I was a sophomore, had RSVP'd yes with a guest. The guest was Ashley. They'd married that April, I learned, in a ceremony at Colleen's Stone Colonial with, I was told, a great deal of flow. I almost didn't go. I want to be honest about the almost. But Renata was going, and my mother wanted to come as a +1 to see the town she grew up near. And something in me had grown a spine over 2 years of stripping thorns and carrying paper and never being late to Estelle, and I decided I would walk into that hall with my mother on my arm. The mother Trevor had once decided didn't flow, and I would let the room see us. I did not go to win anything. I went because I had finally become someone who didn't have to stay home. The reunion was on a Saturday in July in the banquet room above a former Elks Lodge that a young couple had restored with Edison bulbs and reclaimed wood. And I noticed the flowers first, the way I always do, and they were bad, garage carnation bad. And I made peace with that and got my mother a club soda. For an hour it was ordinary and even sweet. Old classmates going soft at the sight of each other, Renata laughing too loud, my mother charming a retired shop teacher who remembered her from church. And then Trevor arrived, and the arriving was a performance, because Trevor Ellison never simply entered a room, he made an entrance, calibrated to look like humility. He was in a summer weight blazer, unhurried, one hand at the small of Ashley's back, and he worked the room the way his father must have worked a boardroom. And when his circuit inevitably brought him to me, he did not flinch or falter or lose a shade of color. He smiled the warm smile I'd once mistaken for love and said, "Thea, you look well. I heard you're still doing the little flower thing. Good for you." The little flower thing. 2 years, 4 employees, $190,000 business I owned free of any bank, and he reached across all of it and set it back down as a hobby. And he did it smiling. And Ashley smiled too. And I understood that the mask was never going to come off. Not tonight, not ever. Because for Trevor, the mask wasn't hiding anything. The mask was the man. There was no trembling coward underneath waiting to be exposed. There was just this, a beautifully controlled surface all the way down. And any fantasy I'd nursed of watching him crumble had been my fantasy, not his fate. So I didn't try to make him crumble. I want you to hear that, because it's the whole hinge of the thing. I stood there with my club soda mother beside me, and I said, "It's Blue Jar Floral, actually. We did the Gaffney wedding at the Chadwick last month. 400 guests." And I watched him file that, the number and the venue, because Trevor respected numbers even when he despised the person holding them. And for just a half second, his smile did a small mathematical thing, and then Colleen materialized at his elbow the way she always had. And here is where the evening tipped, not through any plan of mine. Colleen had been drinking, lightly but audibly, and she was in a mood to hold court. And she looked at my mother. She recognized her. I saw it. And she said to Trevor in a stage whisper meant to be overheard, "Well, at least the seating's better arranged tonight than at your first wedding." She laughed at her own joke. My mother's hand tightened on my arm. And Trevor, God help him, laughed too, the same braided laugh from my old dinner table. And in that laugh, I heard the whole marriage compress into 2 seconds. And I understood that these people were exactly who they had always been, and that no reunion, no success, no passage of time was going to reform them, because they didn't experience what they'd done as harm. To them, it had been logistics. That's when Estelle's voice came into my head, the thing she'd said the first week. "He sounds expensive." And I understood I had one true thing to say, and that I could say it flat, without heat, the way you read a weather forecast, and that saying it wouldn't be revenge. It would just be the removal of a false idea Trevor had apparently kept. "Trevor," I said, "before I forget, I finally updated the life insurance policy last year." He blinked. Ashley's smile held, but her eyes moved. Because here was the thing that had been sitting in a drawer unexamined since 2022. When we married, in the flush of it, I'd taken out a term life policy on myself, $350,000, and named Trevor the sole beneficiary. And in the wreckage of the divorce, nobody's expensive lawyer had thought to unwind it, and it had simply carried on, premiums drafting from an old joint account I'd finally closed. He had gone on being the person who would collect if I died. "I moved it to my mother and my sister," I said, nodding at the woman on my arm, the woman whose seating had once ruined a ballroom's flow. It felt right that the people who actually showed up should be the ones it protects. "I just thought you should know, it isn't you anymore." I have replayed the next 3 seconds many times, and the truth is unsatisfying in the most satisfying way. He didn't pale. He didn't stammer. The mask did not slip. He simply said, "Of course, yes, that makes sense," in the reasonable voice of a man conceding a reasonable point. And he squeezed Ashley's hand the way he used to squeeze mine, and he steered them both toward the bar, unruffled, intact, victorious in his own accounting, because he'd kept his composure and gotten the last pleasant word. He walked away thinking he'd won the exchange. And in a way, he had. That was the shape of his whole win, I realized, watching his blazer recede into the Edison light. Trevor won on the scoreboard he kept, the one where a smooth surface is the only prize. And he would go home to Ashley and Colleen and the stone colonial and their braided cruelty and their perfect seating. And he would keep winning that same hollow point for the rest of his life, in a house where nobody ever showed up for anyone unless the flow allowed it. 24 hours later, I understood what had actually happened at that reunion, and it had nothing to do with the policy. It was Sunday, and I was back at Blue Jar Floral doing what I do every Sunday, which is walk the cooler alone before anyone comes in, checking water levels and pulling anything past its prime. And I was standing there in the cold, clean hum of the walk-in I'd bought back for $200 over spite, and it landed on me all at once. Trevor hadn't reacted because there was nothing in him for the news to reach. I'd spent 2 years half imagining a moment where he'd feel the loss of me the way I'd felt the loss of everything. And the reunion had shown me the plain fact that he was structurally incapable of it. That a man who could uninvite my mother from our wedding and welcome another woman to his mother's table in the same season was not a man who'd been hiding pain. He was a man with a vacancy where the pain should live. The policy disclosure hadn't wounded him. Nothing could. And that, I finally understood, was not my defeat. It was my release. You cannot lose a race against someone who isn't running. And there was one more thing that came clear that Sunday, the piece that let me close the door for good. A month before the reunion, in May, an old classmate named Danny Przinski, a stranger to me really, we'd shared one biology class in 2003 and nothing since, had walked into Blue Jar Floral to order a casket spray for his father, and he'd had almost no money and a lot of grief, and I'd made it beautiful and charged him for the flowers only, no labor, the way Estelle taught me. He'd stood in my shop and cried and told me his dad had run a corner store for 40 years on 3rd Avenue in the same small city where the reunion would be held, and that the whole block was for sale now, the store and 2 vacant lots and the shuttered lodge next door, and that a developer had been lowballing the widows on the street to assemble the parcel cheap. He didn't ask me for anything. He just needed to talk to someone kind for 10 minutes, and I gave it to him, and I forgot about it. Except I hadn't forgotten the block, because when Renata told me where the reunion was, I'd placed it. 3rd Avenue, the restored Elks Lodge with the Edison bulbs, 1 door down from Danny's father's shuttered store. And here is the quiet, incidental justice the prompt of my life handed me without my asking. The developer assembling that block through lowball offers and reputational pressure, buying up a working-class street in a small western Pennsylvania city the way you'd buy a distressed asset, was Meridian Capital, Trevor's family firm. Colleen sat on its advisory board. And the restored banquet hall where Trevor had smiled at me and called my life a little flower thing, the beautiful room he'd made his entrance into, sat on land his own family was quietly trying to strip from people like Danny Przinski's widowed mother. I didn't say a word about it at the reunion. It wasn't mine to weaponize, and I'd learned by then that the loudest move is usually the emptiest. What I did instead that Sunday and the weeks after was quieter and I think more permanent. I called Estelle, who at 64 knew every zoning board and church basement and union hall between Pittsburgh and Kittanning. And I called Danny, and I put $20,000 of Blue Jar's profit, real money I'd earned stripping thorns and running crews and never being late, into an option on his father's store and the lot beside it, at a fair price, a price that let his mother keep her dignity and her half of the block. I didn't own it to win anything. I bought it because I wanted a second location, and because that corner had good afternoon light, and because a man I barely knew had cried in my shop, and I'd found I could do something about it. By that autumn, there was a Blue Jar floral on 3rd Avenue, in the store his father ran for 40 years, 3 doors down from the lodge, and Meridian Capital's tidy assembly of the block had a stubborn cream and blue florist planted dead in the middle of it that would not sell. And I understood that I now owned a piece of the very street Trevor's family had come from and tried to buy, and that I'd done it not by taking anything from him, but by refusing to let his people take something from someone else. That, it turned out, was the whole shape of it. Not a reckoning, not a face going white in a banquet hall, just a life that widened until it quietly overlapped the one that had tried to make me small, and stood there and would not move. I'm 40 now, and it's a Tuesday in the fall as I tell you this, and I've closed both shops early because Renata's boys have a soccer game up in Vandergrift, and my mother is making the pierogi she once wasn't allowed to bring to a ballroom, and I'll drive up in a new enough car with the windows down and the whole back seat full of dahlias I couldn't sell, but couldn't bear to compost. Estelle will be there. She comes to everything now, retired and impossible and beloved, the closest thing my daughterless life has to a grandmother-in-law. Danny Przinski does my deliveries on the 3rd Avenue side 2 days a week. Ashley, I heard through the reliable static of a small city, is finding that Colleen has opinions about seating in her marriage too. And I felt, honestly, a flicker of something almost like pity. They're not enough to slow me down. Before I lock up tonight, I'll do the thing I do every night, the thing I've done since the studio above the hardware store, since the paperwhite leaned toward the crack in the blinds and told me a living thing does the one thing it was built to do with the water it's given. I'll go to the front window of the shop on Grant Street, and I'll take the single stem out of my grandmother's blue ball jar. Tonight, it's one white ranunculus, tight as a fist and just starting to open. And I'll pour out yesterday's water, and I'll fill the jar fresh, and I'll set the flower back in the light where anyone walking past on the sidewalk can see it. Then I'll turn off the lights and drive north toward the pierogi and the soccer game and the people who showed up. And the jar will sit there in the dark, holding its one flower and its clean water, doing exactly what it was built to do, waiting for me to come back in the morning and do it again.